Hello and welcome to Coasset Political Society Show. I'm your host, Marcus Rowland. On this episode tonight, we will be covering the Mueller report and the campaign of Joe Biden. But tonight, I wish to start off with offering our condolences to the loss of an important historical French cathedral, Notre Dame. Construction began on the cathedral in 1163 and was not completed until 1345. It was overseen by Bishop Maurice de Sully. In the 1790s, Notre Dame suffered desecration during the French Revolution. Much of its religious imagery was damaged or destroyed. In the 19th century, the cathedral was the site of the coronation of Napoleon. The cathedral was slowly repaired over the coming centuries, including damage sustained during the Second World War. Each year, 12 million people visit Notre Dame, making it the most visited French landmark. While undergoing renovation and restoration, the roof of Notre Dame caught fire on the evening of the 15th of April 2019. It burned for around 15 hours. The cathedral sustained serious damage, including the destruction of the flèche, the timbered spire over the crossing, and most of the lead-covering wooden roof above the stone-vaulted ceiling. An international restoration fund has been started. The French President Emmanuel Macron has vowed that restoration will not take more than 5 years. Much of the stained glass and historical organ were saved, although this is a true tragedy for France. Our next topic is closer to home, with the release of the Mueller report. The report clears President Donald Trump of any collusion between him and his campaign and the Russian government. The report does make it very clear that despite there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, there is still substantial evidence that the 2016 election had major influence from the Russian government. The report also makes it very clear that there is no cohesive conclusion to whether or not Donald Trump and his staff have committed obstruction of justice. This does not stop the president from claiming that, despite it not being all that he hoped to hear, he has been cleared. Many Democrats think differently, however. Some are still calling for impeachment procedures to begin. The president has said, if the partisan Dems ever tried to impeach, I would first use the Supreme Court. This is despite the fact that in 1993, the Supreme Court ruled that the power to impeach was solely with Congress. However, it does not seem likely. It would be foolish for Democrats to attempt to impeach Donald Trump only for a Republican-controlled Senate to vindicate him. Additionally, it would most likely push voters in the direction of Republicans during the 2020 election. I'd now like to turn to our panelists for some debate on the Mueller report and potential impeachment procedures. Government surveillance versus not?
I'm not, really. Do you think we have nothing to hide?
I really don't care. Government watch my webcam.
I got a white shirt? Oh no, he's got a white shirt.
Well, you got some control room. What's going on?
Check.
How's that?
I heard that.
Check.
This is me yelling.
Clock.
Can I juice up my height on this chair?
Hey, William.
Where's your sheet? You're not gonna know what to say.
Just talk to me.
Instant
I know
advantage.
that. I never look at it.
Oh, jeez. Hold up. There
That's
we
for
go.
my...
We're going to be destroyed. Welcome to
Posture
Coasset Political Society TV, 143 TV.
Posture flex.
This
could say
senior
I'm
girl
fine.
sitting behind me in math class, I don't know who she is because she got way too excited that John was joining us. Like I was talking with Sam about it, like another senior
All
girl.
right, we all
And she
ready?
was just like,
what do you guys want to start with,
I'm
Mueller
not crying,
report
you're
or
crying.
privacy?
Mueller report.
Mueller report, let's go.
Okay. I'd like to introduce our panelists. On my left, I have Ben Birdsey and Cade Wanta, and on the right, I have Sean Thornton and Matt Grimes. So I'd like to open it up to anyone who wants to say anything about the Mueller report.
Well, I think it's that the Mueller report's findings are very good for the president. Very important, they clear him of any allegations of Russian collusion, which was the purpose of the creation of the Mueller probe in the first place. They disprove many media myths about the Trump campaign. Just to name a few examples, Paul Manafort did not send polling data to the Russian government. Michael Cohen did not meet with Russian government officials in Prague, as the Steele dossier alleged. And Trump did not fire, the investigation did not establish that Trump fired Jim Comey due to his concerns over the Russia investigation. And it also showed that Trump was not aware of Michael Flynn's activities with the Russian ambassador in the post-election pre-inauguration period. And I think that As per the second volume of the Mueller report, the one concerning obstruction of justice, even Mueller reports on, and Mueller says on page 48 of that second volume that it would need a corrupt motive in order to establish a charge of obstruction of justice. And it's a bit difficult to do that, while in the first volume it completely absolves Trump or even his top campaign members of committing crimes with the Russian government, which is what the investigation was looking into.
Would you say it completely absolves the president?
I would say it doesn't completely absolve him of the obstruction charges. It seemed like it was very vague on that. I don't know. It didn't say that it needed a motive, from what I read. But I'm sure it had like corrupt intent in there. So I think if Trump's enemies wanted to run with that, they'd be able to. I don't know how well it would go, but they definitely have enough to go on to be able to do something with it.
There have been calls to still attempt to impeach the president, and the president responded with a threat to sue and send the lawsuit up through the Supreme Court. Is this a valid strategy?
I don't think that's how it works.
I don't believe it is either. But
Well, I think there are definitely a lot of legal abnormalities to say regarding the origin of the Mueller investigation and the entire Russian investigation, specifically surrounding the FBI's wiretapping of Trump campaign member Carter Page and how they approached obtaining the warrants to wiretap him and several other members of Trump's campaign. And I think that those definitely deserve to be looked into.
Yeah, I'd say yeah, that's possible, but all FISA warrants are looked at by a judge, so it would just have to be rejudged.
Does anybody else have?
Yeah, do you think the investigation was necessary?
Well, even the investigation itself says that the investigation wasn't necessary because it absolved the president of any crimes relating to the Russian government. And the only crimes that left up in the air were relating to the investigation itself. So I don't think it was necessary at all, no.
So you think the investigation is pointless?
Yes, but I'd be a bit more soft in phrasing.
I feel like the investigation would help Trump win another because it showed that he did not, losing a word.
Collude?
Yeah, and that it was a made-up story by the Democrats.
The report did show evidence of Russian involvement in the election, which I believe the president had previously stated did not in fact happen. So does that, the contradiction of that against the president, does that hurt the president in any way?
Well, I think that the issue of Russia's involvement in the election was sort of the media made it more about an issue of whether the president committed crimes, and so did Obama and his FBI, who didn't really try to forge an attempt to stop Russia from involvement in the election, but rather used it as a reason to spy on Trump's campaign and Trump himself.
So what you're saying is that the Obama FBI intentionally spied on the Trump campaign and attempted to influence it in some way, and that Hillary Clinton still lost despite this?
I think what they did was, usually when you have something being investigated, you have a crime and you're looking for the people responsible. But in this case, the FBI had people who they really wanted to have committed a crime, so they started investigating them and looking for any possible thing without proper reason to investigate. For example, Paul Manafort was recently sent to federal prison for tax fraud from the early 2000s that was in no way related to his activities in the Trump campaign, but those charges were brought forth as a result of the Mueller investigation into Trump's campaigns and its connections are now no connections with the Russian government.
So are you saying that despite the fact that an investigation found evidence of somebody committing a crime, even though the investigation wasn't about that person, the investigation should just ignore that evidence?
Well, I don't think it should be. I believe all crimes should be prosecuted, but there is also such thing as, in the legal world, they have a thing called the fruit of the poisonous tree. I'll give an example. If a cop car pulls you over for not signaling to turn, which they legally can't pull you over for, and they find, let's say, drugs in the back of your car, you cannot be sent to jail because they did not have probable cause to search your vehicle. I would argue that this concept applies to the Trump campaign, as the FBI was dubious at best in its obtaining warrants to spy on and investigate the Trump campaign.
Okay. Does anybody have any more remarks on the Mueller investigation? All right, we're going to pivot into our next topic. Okay. Good job. And we'll go into the next one. Don, you can just leave it.
Pretty good.
Yep, let it run.
What?
He'll let it run.
Did you say something?
I said it was good
Oh,
performance.
he said it was good.
All right.
So,
You're about 8 minutes in.
You
Okay.
better have a hot take here, because I'm not really.
Oh no.
Okay.
Do you have a?
Kinda sorta.
What?
I was saying he better have a
both
hot
are kinda
take here, because
neutral.
I'm not really as much informed, like as much as the Mueller subject. But anyway, I can go ahead.
It's like WikiLeaks.
Yeah, I know that.
Just like you can talk about WikiLeaks, you can talk about Julian Assange, we can talk about right to privacy versus national security, like Patriot Act,
I got it.
all of that. Right. I'd like to welcome our panelists. So we have Ben Bernsey and Cade Wanta on the left, and Sean Thornton and Matt Grimes on the right. So we're discussing national security versus the right to privacy due to the recent arrest of Julian Assange in London. Does anybody have any opening thoughts that they want to start with?
Well, I'd like to say that the British government, who is trying to arrest Julian Assange on some outdated charge of missing a court date, is being quite tyrannical in their treatment of him. And I think it's easy to see why. This man has done more to expose the governments of the world and to shed light on their activities than any other journalist out there.
I would agree, definitely. He was cleared of his charge in Sweden. I think they accused him of molesting a child,
Yeah,
and then
he had
while he was
two
in
crimes against him, rape and molestation
Yeah.
charge.
and while he was in the embassy, he was cleared of those crimes, but they still held the court date against him, like you said, just because he had worked against the government.
He's wanted in the U.S. for
Exposing
classified information,
attempting to
Yeah.
expose. Yeah.
which is like a real crime, and so they have him in London on the avoiding the court hearing, but they're most likely going to extradite him to the U.S. for the more serious crime of that. So
Well, I think the government should introduce more legislation to protect whistleblowers like Assange and like Chelsea Manning, who were involved in the exposure of the government's activities in Iraq and regarding their prisoners of war in Iraq. And I think that Assange, I think his activities should be encouraged more than discouraged. When you're talking about something like the United States military committing crimes in Iraq, or something like the Democratic Party rigging its own primaries.
okay, this has re-sparked the age-old debate of national security versus a citizen's right to privacy. So do you think it's national security should take prevalence over someone's like privacy rights, or
I think privacy should definitely take priority. I think that, like, especially under the Patriot Act, under the broad surveillance, that never really stopped any terrorists. It was always the targeted surveillance that would help.
I feel like it should be a balance between the two, because too much national security means that everyone knows everything about a person, and then all privacy means nothing is known about anyone. So I feel balance would be the optimal solution.
Well, I think if you don't have rights, but you do have security, you're not really securing anything. The only thing you're securing is the people's ability not to die in some imaginary terror attack, which so far the Patriot Act has prohibited zero of. Whether your rights are what separate you from the people who are governed by oppressive, some would say terroristic governments.
So the the NSA and other government agencies take information online, like, and record it about people. Do you think that's an okay use of national security versus?
I think it is, especially for online predators. I think it's definitely necessary. Just increased government involvement in that sense, because that certainly has prevented a number of events from happening, especially with online predators.
Does anyone disagree?
I would agree with the point that the government should be doing a lot to surveil the internet and people's activities on the internet. But when it comes to people's personal property, the Constitution is clear. You need a warrant. You can't just spy on everything.
To move slightly away from government surveillance to, like, private corporations, like companies like Google and like Facebook have tons and tons of data on people now. Do you think that's fair? And what kind of, like, uses to that information would you see as?
I think that's fair, because Google is a public platform and you're choosing to put your information into it. It's not like a private server. So I feel like any information you put onto it, Google has the right to have that because it is their website.
But I'd have to disagree with Kate on this one. The people really misconstrue what the Constitution means. The Constitution is not the Bible of rights. It simply names some rights and names some legal protections for rights in relation to the law of the United States. Just because Google is a private company doesn't mean that selling your information is not a violation of your privacy. It still is, and it still is, I think, very unfair.
So for cases such as selling drugs online, child pornography, other illegal activities, you don't think the government should be involved in those?
When you're talking about the government surveilling of illegal activities, that should definitely continue. But as for a company like Google or Facebook selling your data to corporations that want it for one use or another, I think that is still very unfair.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Could a private company like Google take your information and sell it to the government? Would that be an acceptable use of their information on you?
I think that it would be legal if they were to do that, but it shouldn't be. I think laws should be made against it.
I agree with Ben on that. I believe it currently is, to the best of my knowledge, legal. But it definitely, I don't think there should be a law prohibiting that.
Does anybody want to talk about anything else involved in national security or privacy rights, or?
Yeah, just one thing. With regards to recording people's microphones, I think that should be prohibited. I feel like that's a violation of people's rights. Because even though you do have a phone, I feel like searching something versus like talking about something is a lot different. And the government, I feel like, should not have the right to, or even Google, like, sell your information based on like what you're saying.
So like a Google Home or like a Siri app shouldn't be allowed to just record and then like match things that you like talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree.
Kind of creepy, actually. All right, any other closing thoughts? All right, that's all the time we got for in this segment. Now on to review the former Vice President Joe Biden. On Thursday, April the 26th, Joe Biden officially announced his intention to run for president. The 47th Vice President has been a strong contender without having done any campaigning. He was a strong contender for the 2016 Democratic nominee without even running. The former Vice President has the advantage of having been in the public eye for over a decade. He has had a mostly controversial free political career. He is currently campaigning on a strategy of stability and reassurance during a time when much of the political world is not. He has not, unlike many of his fellow Democratic candidates, shot far to the left, instead keeping his politics centrist and moderate. He believes that this will give him better chances in the long run, even if it does not mean that he is a splashy candidate now. He is now 76 and will not be elected until 2020, at which time he will be 78. It is not complex math to understand that by the end of his first potential term, he will be 82. Many young Democrats have in recent years felt alienated from an ever-aging and unchanging Democratic leadership. However, the top two candidates for the Democrats are in their late 70s, being Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden is universally the number 2 candidate in the polls behind Bernie Sanders, who has been for a long time trying to pull the Democratic Party further to the left. It is interesting to note how these two frontrunners differ. One side wants to remain less liberal and more in the straight and narrow, and the other side wants to hook Democrats far to the left. It will be interesting to see where the election goes. Welcome back to A World View. Today we will be looking into the long and complex history of Indonesia. Today, Indonesia is the 4th largest country in the world by population, with a little over more than 261 million people, and has the 7th largest GDP in the world at $3.7 trillion. Ideal agricultural conditions and the mastering of wet field rice cultivation as early as the 8th century BC allowed villages, towns, and small kingdoms to flourish by the 1st century AD. The archipelago's strategic sea lane position fostered inter-island and international trade, including links with Indian kingdoms and Chinese dynasties. From the 1st to the 16th century AD, the archipelago was home to a series of Hindu-Buddhist politics. These were due to several large and successful naval kingdoms developing in the area during this time period. The late 13th century saw the founding of the Hindu Mahasabha kingdom in eastern Java. It was one of the most powerful empires in Southeast Asia, under Ganja Mada. Its influence stretched over much of present-day Indonesia. The first regular contact between Europeans and the people of the archipelago began in 1512, when Portuguese traders, led by Francisco Serrano, sought to monopolize the source of nutmeg, cloves, and Cuban pepper in Malacca. After the Portuguese, other Europeans followed, notably the Dutch. In 1602, the Dutch established the Dutch East India Trading Company. For almost 200 years, the company was dominant over European power in the archipelago. It was dissolved in 1800 following bankruptcy, and the Netherlands established the Dutch East Indies as a national colony. Starting from 1840, the Dutch began a period of expansion to enlarge and consolidate their possessions outside Java, mainly to protect areas already held and prevent intervention from other European powers. As a result, they began involved in numerous wars against various native groups throughout the 19th centuries, such as the Pandari War, the Java War, and the long and costly Akeko War. It was only in the first half of the 20th century that the Dutch exerted control over what was to become Indonesia's current boundaries, with the addition of Western New Guinea in 1920. In 1901, the Netherlands introduced Dutch ethical policy that was aimed at improving the living conditions and welfare, expanding education to native peoples, and preparing the archipelago for self-government under Dutch control. The policy, however, contributed to the Indonesian national awakening and subsequent rise of independence movements, which the Dutch actively suppressed. During World War II, the Empire of Japan invaded and occupied the archipelago, effectively ending Dutch rule. Despite causing a total of 4 million deaths, the Japanese occupation was fundamental for Indonesian independence, as Japanese encouraged and facilitated Indonesian nationalism, promoting nationalists such as Sukarno, Mohammed Hatta, and Kihara Dewantara, and provided weapons and military training. Just 2 days after the surrender of Japan, Sukarno and Hatta proclaimed Indonesian independence on the 17th of August, 1945, and were selected as the country's first president and vice president, respectively. The Netherlands attempted to re-establish their rule, and an armed and diplomatic struggle ensued. In December 1949, the Dutch formally recognized Indonesian independence in face of international pressure. Western Guyana remained under Dutch control for the next 2 decades. The 1997 Asian financial crisis, which hit Indonesia particularly hard, led to an end of the new order, and subsequently the occupation of East Timor. In the post-Suharto era, a strengthening of democracy, which included a regional autonomy program and first direct presidential election in 2004. Political and economic instability, social unrest, corruption, and terrorism slowed progress, however. In recent years, the economy has performed strongly. Although relations among diverse population groups are largely harmonious, sectarian disconnect and violence has persisted. Indonesia was the worst hit country by the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami that killed around 167,000 people, mainly at Teki. The aftermath of the disaster played a part in achieving political settlement to an armed separatist conflict in the region in 2005. A constant and ever important part of past, present, and future Indonesia is that it is located on the Ring of Fire, so called for its large presence of volcanoes. But what is far more important is that 90% of the world's earthquakes happen in this region. Today, Indonesia is in the news for its plans to move its capital away from Jakarta and even away from the island of Java. The small island contains close to 140 million people. This has pushed infrastructure beyond its limits. Additionally, with climate change and rising sea levels, it is becoming all the more necessary to seek a new place for a capital. The final nail in the coffin for Jakarta is that it is literally sinking. There is a slow and constant release of groundwater, which is causing the city to sink into the ground. Indonesia is planning on spending $33 billion to move the capital. A potential city is Palangkaraya on the island of Borneo. The past, present, and future of Indonesia is rich and interesting, and the future looks well. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for. I'll see you next time.